Hello, everyone. Today, for the next 50 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about the school to work transition and career success. So I'm going to talk just briefly about those concepts because I want you to have more time with our panelists today. When we talk about the school to work transition, we are talking really broadly about transitions into the workplace. That can be from high school, it can be from college, it can be from university, it can also be from a time off of work, but it is a transition into work. And really, really importantly, there's been lots of work here from practitioners, from researchers, but we don't often think about career success. And so our group here is really, really focused on that. And we hope that you will also feel that it matters. Either you already do now or will in the future. And our purpose here is that we're not just talking about transitions into work, but transitions into jobs that individuals truly want. And that can be what we sometimes call objective career success, which is jobs that give someone access to promotion, career advancement, non-precarious work and such. But it can also be the subjective side, which is arguably the most important, which is the person doing what they want to be doing, having access to the work that they desire. So that's it for me from the kind of intro on the panel. Our format is going to be 4 questions for our panelists, and then we'll go to Q&A. So hopefully we'll have a lot of time to speak with our panelists, and I'm not going to introduce them. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And so our first question is, can you please tell us about yourself and your experience related to the school to work transition?
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here, so thank you. My name is Susan Foley. I'm a career counselor at Yale University's Career Center on Field Campus in Toronto. So part of my role as a career counselor, my background is I am certified as a counselor. So I use ability further to coach our students to help them explore their career transition plan. So part of my portfolio as well is working with students with disabilities. So I work in partnership with Career Center, partnership with student accessibility services like school to work transitions, and I'll be talking about that in part of our panel discussion today. Prior to my time at York University, I've spent several years in nonprofit in case management, supporting job seekers with disabilities.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arif Jetta, and I'm a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. I'm also an associate scientific director at the organization. So what do I do related to the school to work transition of persons with disabilities? I've been studying the role of the work environment and how it can create opportunities and challenges for persons with disabilities for the last decade. And what I noticed during this period of time is that the working world is changing quite rapidly. And so that's been a real big focus of my research, is the future of work, a theme of this conference. And in particular, how will the future of work change the composition of jobs in our labor market? And how is the work environment changing? Both the physical work environment as well as the psychosocial work environment. And what does that mean for persons with disabilities? And just to give you a little bit of a kind of a intro to some of this research, we've been doing this work for a couple of years. And what we've learned when we talk to persons with disabilities is that they are at added disadvantage when entering the future of work. Having a disability can make it hard to think about the future. Very immediate challenges are kind of top of mind. Persons with disabilities have told us that they face barriers to obtaining job skills needed to compete for jobs of the future. Also, many persons with disabilities find themselves on the wrong end of the digital divide. And as we know, digital technology is critical to participating in today's labor market. And very lastly, persons with disabilities in our research have told us that they're pushed into low quality and precarious employment, which makes it challenging to kind of advance in one's career and obtain high quality employment that can really lead itself to career success.
Hi there, my name is Sinead McCarthy and I'm Vice President at Youth Employment Services. I've been working in this field for about 25 years, and my interest really lies in developing programs that are very aligned to the labour market. So looking at making sure that persons with disabilities are getting into meaningful positions, that they're upskilled quickly. One example would be, we worked with Amazon Web Services, who said they really needed cloud practitioners that there was labour market shortages, and we convinced them to help us run a program that would specifically help persons with disabilities get certified as a cloud practitioner using their curriculum and into meaningful employment. And then we learned a lot, whereby we knew what was needed within that workplace. So looking at mentorship, looking at a navigator position in the workplace to really help onboard persons with disabilities, recognizing the barriers that exist. My second focus has been working with employers. So doing what we all do, a lot of employer training and awareness, and really looking at the challenge where CEOs are saying we want to become more inclusive, but when you go down the ladder, the access for persons with disabilities still isn't where it should be. So what we're doing is saying, thank you for your statement that you want to be inclusive. Now hire 5 people, please. And so we're running a really practical program where we are doing the training, but asking them to actually commit to hiring persons with disabilities.
Hello, I'm Kim Atwood. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's University. Currently, I'm Dan's research assistant, but professionally, I'm a retired occupational therapist. And for me, I got past the national exam, became registered with a college, and then realized that every occupational therapy job required a driver's license, something I could not obtain because of financial reasons. And also I didn't have access to a vehicle with hand controls. And so I became self-employed. But when I was a student, I had tons of funding for assistive technology to help me do my work. But when you're self-employed, there's no funding. So if you need expensive software, or if you need your wheelchair repaired or something else, where do you get the funding? And even if I was working for an employer, if the employer is someone like Queen's University, okay, they have the funding to accommodate my needs. But if I'm working for a small business, where do they access funding to help accommodate me? So for me, that transition, the lack of funding, the lack of a driver's license, lack of transportation really affected my ability to transition from school to work.
Thank you. And so, yeah, I'm working with Kim. I'm at Queen's University as well. And just in case, if you want to learn more about the folks on the panel, I was told that in the agenda, there are QR codes where there's more information, and you can always reach out to us as well. So my next question is about what you are encountering now, or the work that you're doing in the school to work transition space. So we'll start with Kim, please.
Well, of course, I've mentioned I'm Dan's research assistant. So we're looking at going through interviews where participants are talking about the barriers and facilitators to school to work transition. And the really nice thing is that we ask them about the barriers, but then we ask the participants, and what's the solution? And we're getting a wide variety of solutions. You know, and it's just brilliant how diverse solutions are. And the fact that even though 2 people might have the same disability, the solutions to successful career advancement can be quite different.
We'll go to Susan next.
Thank you. So at York University, again, I work in partnership with Student Accessibility Services. The Career Center and Student Accessibility Services offers every year an annual Classroom to Career series, specifically for students with disabilities. And we offer a range of programming with our Classroom to Career series. So that is specifically helping students, again, think about transitioning from school to work. Often when students are in school, they're in more of a bit of a bubble that they know how to access accommodations. They know how to reach out to their supports. But when they start to transition outside of academics, it feels very overwhelming. It can feel very new to them. So we really want to make that transition as smooth as possible and have them have access to resources around them. Part of the Classroom to Career series that York offers, we offer a dialogue on disability disclosure in the workplace. So that's a discussion around how to disclose, when to disclose, who to disclose to, how to access accommodations within the workplace. It always circles back to disclosure conversations. And that's what we find in our Classroom to Career series. A lot of students, if they have a non-visible, non-apparent disability, the question comes up, do I disclose? Do I not disclose? So we offer a lot of supports in relation to disability disclosure. We also have Lyme Connect come in. I heard Lyme Connect being mentioned earlier, and I believe they did a presentation here last year. Lyme Connect is a strong community partner that we work with. And they come in, they talk about how to rebrand disability through achievement. They provide a lot of fantastic information about community partnerships. So that's part of our Classroom to Career series as well. And then we also offer employer meet and greets specifically for students with disabilities. That's very, as my colleague was saying, very practical. So they get to meet with these employers, they get to understand recruitment cycles, they get to understand their inclusive hiring practices and accommodation discussions as well. So that is some of the areas that we provide supports as students are transitioning into the workforce. And we do provide supports up to 2 years after students graduate. So sometimes we find students will come back and saying, I think I want to have that disability disclosure. We also offer on-the-job success supports as well to ensure that they have, as Dan was saying, having that ability to have a career, but also self-reflecting of how they define a career that's meaningful, that's purposeful and successful for them on their own terms.
Thank you. And so Sinead.
Yeah, so my interest and some of my experience is around about 10 years ago, we were seeing an increase in persons disclosing specifically mental health disabilities. And so we worked with the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health and recognized that the research was clear that when you combine mental health services in employment programming, by offering, counseling, cognitive behavior therapy, mental health and addiction support, and you combine that within an employment program, that the success rates were higher. And so we set out to do that, and we've recognized that. And some of our other lessons are really engaging employers early, looking at meaningful employment. So really working individually with people to understand what their interests, aptitudes, skills, experience are, and customizing the job search towards those, but also looking at onboarding. So recognizing that if there's not a good experience for a person through the onboarding and then mentorship within employment, so identifying navigators or mentorships who will help people maintain employment, we really built out a program that has a great success rate. So we're looking at about 80% of the people hired maintaining employment for 6 months, and looking at the average wage being about $26 an hour. Those were the important things to us. We learned a lot along the way. We learned what didn't work, which was great, because it helped us, change our tactics. Most importantly, I think we had an advisory group of persons with disabilities informing our programming. And I think that's one of the keys to success. Just very simply put, though, until employers really do open their doors and recognize the value and the business case to be made with hiring people with disabilities, then, our work is futile until we have employers as partners, really opening the doors and making it happen, in my opinion, is where we need to focus a lot of our work.
Thank you. And so Arif.
Yeah, so I'll wait for, you're okay. My main role on the panel is to provide like the research perspective, and that's kind of where I spend my space or my time, which is to kind of develop insights, applied insights that are relevant to practitioners like Susan and Sinead, and can be used in the field to benefit the employment of persons with disabilities. And so maybe about 10 years ago, we have created a big body of literature highlighting the role the work environment can play in kind of supporting persons with disabilities. And so this can include the psychosocial work environment, so how supportive your supervisor is or your colleagues are. It can also include aspects of the physical environment, your access to accessible technology within the work environment, as well as other types of extended benefits. So we've established this. This is well known. But as mentioned earlier, one of the things we acknowledged was things are changing and we want to understand what those changes look like. And so we've been doing a lot of work in the space of strategic foresight. And what that means is we're examining different social, technological, economic, environmental, and political forces that are changing our working world. A big theme that's emerged, and one that I'm sure folks in this room are have observed as well, is the digital transformation of the economy. We are seeing the rapid implementation of technologies like artificial intelligence, which are changing the composition of jobs which are available. They're also changing the work environment, and they're creating this situation where now human workers are having to work adjacently with intelligent machines. Well, what does that mean for persons with disabilities? Well, we're trying to understand that right now. As you can imagine, it could create a number of amazing opportunities. It can maybe take the most mundane and stressful tasks and allocate them to machines. And then as a result, kind of optimize the human worker and optimize the skills that persons with disabilities can bring to a work environment. It could also mean displacement. It could also mean that you're now more stressed because you're having to account to an intelligent machine. And so one of my main roles and one of the areas I spend a lot of my time is trying to understand this a bit more and trying to build implications that then Susan and Sinead and other practitioners in the field can utilize to best inform their practice.
Great. Okay, so we've heard about, the future of work, research, lived experience. We've heard about career services role here, and underneath, I think a lot of what was discussed is the role of the employer. And we've heard it, I think, earlier today too, and I mean for a long, long time, about the need for culture change, the need for employers to be doing their part in this. And I want to comment, some of the research that many of us are doing as part of IDEA, the Inclusive Design for Employment Access group, because we need one more acronym, is really on that side of, hey, we have been tooling up individuals for a long time. We need to be tooling up employers. We need to be working with employers, as Sinead said, kind of opening those doors, making sure that we are engaging there. So my next question, I'm going to ask Sinead to speak first. And this is about what advice you would have for employers, if there are any in the audience or beyond.
For sure. So we launched a national project where we are trying to understand, why are rates of unemployment so high? And really, why are employers saying we really want to onboard persons with disabilities, but when you look at your statistics, it's really low. So some of the challenges are, AI has had a negative impact in terms of hiring. So a lot of people with disabilities applying are automatically screened out. So a very practical AI, fail is right there. We were very surprised that large employers like the TTC came to us and said, we are lost here. We have disability statements, but our supervisors, when they hear the word accommodations freeze, or when they hear, it's a person with a disability. So there's a lot of stigma and bias still there. And so our work is multifold in terms of real hands-on training. Where you stuck, is it at the hiring? Is it that your supervisors are just, not equipped or learned enough to understand around hiring, around inclusive hiring? And then we also are concerned that oftentimes a person with disability is in the lowest paying job. And so is this tokenism, or is it really hiring people towards their skills? And so there's lots of challenges. What we're trying to do is build solutions and showing the value of a business case around people with disabilities. Because if you think about it, the research is clear that if you have a disability and you get a job, that job is so important to you because you're out in the community, you're getting an income. And so the research is clear that persons with disabilities have a very high value on employment and are excellent employees and have less attendance issues. So it's dispelling those myths as well. So we've started working. I think we've seen a shift in the labour market. When there's greater labour market needs, it's an easier sell to employers, and when you can make the business case. So I'm, hopeful for the future, but I still think there's a long way to go.
Thank you. And Susan, please.
So thank you. So as you just heard, York University students that are students with disabilities are very hardworking. They're very determined. They're very reliable. They know how to self-accommodate. And sometimes it's the smallest, and Kim and I were talking about this earlier, sometimes it's the smallest accommodation that makes the biggest difference. But again, as we've heard, sometimes employers feel they hear the word accommodation and they think it's going to be costly, or I'm a small company, I'm not sure what we could implement or how we could manage. And sometimes really what it is it's focusing on the abilities, focusing on the strengths of the employees. We have I think it's just over right now, 5,000 students that are registered at York University as a student with a disability. And that's who's registered. So we know for a fact there's more students on campus that chose not to register with student accessibility services, and perhaps students that are not diagnosed yet for whatever reason. So right there, you have such a large pool of potential fantastic employees that have strengths, that have abilities. And when we have the employers connect with the students, such as our meet and greet recruitment sessions that we have for students with disabilities, that's really a two-way street, a two-way window that they're hearing from the students. The students know how to self-accommodate. And these students in turn are hearing from the employers, some of the larger employers that already have inclusive hiring practices in place, that it's about the conversation. It's about focusing on their strengths, focusing on their abilities, and helping them be successful. And I feel that as we increase that conversation and increase that engagement, we're finding that it's a way to open up those doors.
Great. And so thinking again about advice to employers, Arif.
Yeah, so this is something I think about quite a bit as we generate evidence from the research that we conduct at the Institute for Work and Health. And so what can employers do? If I was to talk to an employer right now, I would probably give kind of two pieces of advice, or two things I would promote. The first is to continue to recognize the role that persons with disabilities can play within a changing labor market. And a good example I'd like to provide is with the automation of work. There are soft skills and lived experience that persons with disabilities bring to a workplace that cannot be automated and can be quite valuable as a resource for employers to utilize and to build a better workplace and to kind of meet productivity goals. And we should be really focusing on that and understanding that a little bit more within this kind of digital work environment that we are now in. The second is to understand how changes we make or employers make in the workplace can impact persons with disabilities as well as other groups of workers. So how does the adoption of new technology, how can it be optimized in a way that kind of enhances the strengths of different groups of workers? How can changes to different workplace policies impact workers with disabilities? And a good example is obviously the move to hybrid work. Was accessibility and inclusion thought about when we moved to hybrid work in the middle of the pandemic or in the early stages of the pandemic? I think persons with disabilities need to be at the forefront of these new policy changes as they emerge. And I think we need to respond to new challenges on the horizon. So think strategically. A good example is the climate crisis that is kind of emerging before us. To what extent will inclusion be part of our response to climate disasters for workers who have to work outdoors, who have a disability or have to commute to work? I think by providing an inclusion lens to that, it allows us to get ahead or think strategically about some of the issues that could emerge. And then very lastly is that as the labor market changes, so too does the demand for workers with different skills. So employers should be thinking about how to skill up their employees, especially persons with disabilities, to meet those gaps and to kind of bridge their requirement for workers with complex technological and soft skills.
Kim, do you?
Believe it or not, I'm not actually a disabled employee. I am not a broken person because I use a wheelchair. If I'm properly accommodated in the workplace, my disability is non-existent. But I've missed out on job interviews because I got a call at 9 a.m. saying, be a job interview for 2:30. Well, I use paratransit. I use accessible taxis. They have to be booked in advance. My life doesn't work on short notice. And if I have an employer that's okay with the fact that I might arrive a few minutes late because paratransit is running late, that's really helpful. But the whole idea of accommodation in the workplace, if, a lot of times in years past, the accommodation will be put Kim's office on the ground floor, but my team is working on the 4th floor. And I'm now isolated away from my team. Working remotely during COVID helped me to overcome my transportation issues. But again, I'm isolated from my team. And I miss out on building social relationships with my colleagues. And that can affect my ability to be promoted within the workplace. Because if I'm not seen in the workplace, I'm not thought of when it comes for promotions. So now I actually refuse to be isolated away from my colleagues. If my team is on the 4th floor, I'm now saying you have to figure out how to get me out of the building if there's a power failure and I'm stuck on the 4th floor. It is my employer's responsibility to figure out how to get me out of the building, because giving me a ground floor office is no longer beneficial to my career advancement. And it can be really difficult to try and present that type of advocacy and saying, no, that solution will not work for me. And not everyone has that ability. So if you have someone like Sinead or Susan or Arif who can also help support you in getting the solution you actually need, then your disability should not be a problem in the workplace.
Thank you. And I think there's two words kind of for me that come to mind when I hear what's been shared for employers. One is proactive and one is flexible. There's the idea, especially right from Susan and Sinead, these ideas of people coming out and collaborating, working with service providers, working with career services folks, working with researchers as well, with RF, on these subjects to do better. But no matter what, there's going to be a point where that proactivity meets a new challenge. And in those moments, being flexible, right? Not being rigid to whatever we thought is the best answer, but to go, hey, we have a 4th floor office and we need to get our employee, Kim, to that office. Let's not make Kim solve the problem. Let's solve the problem either as the organization or with Kim, which I think is a very different framing. And hopefully we're moving towards that framing. Now, our last question is a bit of a bigger one. It's about the changing world that we're in. There's a lot going on these days around work shifting towards being, more areas of work like gig work, precarious work. We heard also about technology shifting potentially how work will be in the future. We don't really know. We just have a lot of speculation at this point. And so I'm wondering what our panelists think are kind of the important next steps in this space. And we're going to start with RF.
Well, thank you for asking that, Dan. As I mentioned, it's top of mind. And in fact, I have a couple slides that I would love to pull up. So if the folks in the IT back end, if they can pull the slides up. Excellent. Thank you so much. So as mentioned, in previous research that we've led, we've been utilizing traditional methods like surveys and qualitative research to get a sense of the barriers and facilitators that young workers faced as they were transitioning into the world of work. But we wanted to understand what's on the horizon. And so on this slide is a report that we recently led at the Institute for Work and Health, and the QR code is available. If you find it challenging to utilize a QR code, which I do, come to me afterwards and I'll either link you to the website directly or I can give you a copy of the QR code to scan directly. But what we wanted to do in this process was to implement an approach called strategic foresight. And this is an approach that's utilized quite a bit in management, policymaking, and other industries. And strategic foresight is a systematic, participatory, and action-oriented methodological process. And the goal is to build a medium to long-term view of the future. And we want to understand what the future of work look like for young persons with disabilities. And the ultimate kind of objective of strategic foresight is not to predict the future. Rather, it explores alternative potential futures that could emerge. It draws on diverse expertise, insights, and ideas, and it will ultimately generate evidence that fosters preparedness and resilience. So in the report, you will see that we developed 3 potential scenarios for a future working world in which persons with disabilities might encounter. I won't go through each scenario, and I encourage you to download the report if you're interested in learning more. But I just wanted to highlight that each scenario differs in terms of the role government plays in the working world, changing working conditions, the role of climate and climate change, economic realities, as well as societal values. And through these different kind of themes, we were able to kind of build new stories or different narratives. So what could we do with those narratives? Well, we see these tools as a practical tool to encourage speculative thinking, conversations, and visioning. And this is something that I would really encourage folks attending this conference to really think about within their scope of practice, to vision what could the future look like for persons with disabilities within the working world. And then ultimately foster strategic discussions on policy and programmatic developments related to inclusive employment, and generate solutions that are resilient to potential changes in the future of work. So utilizing the report or other strategic foresight approaches, some questions you could start to ask yourself as you've built the different alternative scenarios is, what challenges and opportunities are raised in each scenario that are relevant to inclusive employment? What does each scenario have in common with others in terms of challenges and opportunities for young persons with disabilities? Considering the needs of persons living with a disability, what would a well-designed strategy look like within each alternative future? And what actions would you take to succeed in more than one of the future scenarios to help build resilience in the face of the future? And so, again, this is just one specific tool, but it's a tool that I think can be utilized for folks to kind of think and vision of the future. So that's kind of where we're going at the Institute, but I'm curious to hear what Susan and Sinead are thinking about. Oh, sorry.
We'll have Sinead go next, please.
So I really think we're at a unique time where, you know, with people like Kim, if we can convene people, and I'm really grateful that our federal government and provincial governments are investing, because there's a recognition that we will be facing labour market shortages. That's a sad thing that had to happen to make us more interested in hiring people with disabilities, but I see it as an opportunity. The good news is that there is a lot of investment. I think what I'd like to see the future have is more room for collaboration with people coming together, employers, persons with disabilities, service providers, to really understand the issue and the intersects between us as career counsellors, helping people with, you know, transitioning to work, people with disabilities having a voice, because as Kim said earlier, sometimes it's the simplest thing. So if we can bridge those gaps between service providers, persons with disabilities and employers more rigorously and do more of this work, then, you know, the future will be better, because we'll be having employers recognize the value of persons with disabilities. We'll have persons with disabilities really get those meaningful jobs. There's also an opportunity in the future of work in terms of oftentimes the positions that the labour market will demand will be those that can be very quickly upskilled to. So employers are not looking for 4-year degrees anymore. They're looking for skills that are aligned to the labour market. And so there's an opportunity there as well to quickly recognize persons with disabilities as a great labour force, upskill them quickly in in-demand jobs, and have large-scale employers actually, you know, onboard and maintain persons with disabilities at wages that are appropriate to those jobs. So I think the future looks bright. I think there's room for more collaboration, more coming together. And I think, you know, sitting here today from Youth Employment Services and being on this panel, when you bring policymakers, government, academia, and persons with disabilities with service providers together, I think the future is quite bright. So I'm positive.
Thank you. And I think it's a really important point. You know, earlier we were talking about employers and the need for employers to kind of change practice and shift and become more inclusive. And I think a part of this is also the realization that we exist within systems, and that collaboration is just a core element of that. And no one actor can do everything alone. So it's not employers doing this alone. It's doing this in partnership with all the different people, you know, we see up here and also outside of this room as well. And Kim, after you.
I'm employed. Great. If my wheelchair breaks, I'm suddenly no longer employed because I can't get to work if my wheelchair isn't working. A wheelchair like this costs $5,000. If I'm self-employed, where do I find $5,000 to get a new wheelchair? If I'm on social assistance, like the Ontario Disability Support Program, okay, ODSP will pay for wheelchair repairs, but ODSP's employment earnings deduction policy now limits how much I can make. Because if I earn too much, I'm now off ODSP. So I'm kind of trapped in this cycle of I need ODSP to help me pay for wheelchair repairs and other needs. But if I'm working, I'm always worried about getting kicked off ODSP. And if I get kicked off ODSP and something breaks, like my wheelchair, then I lose my job and end up back on ODSP. So I think there needs to be some thoughts in terms of funding. Because when you're transitioning from school to work and you're now an employee, where do you go for supports? Because a service like Susan's Career Services won't help me with wheelchair repairs. Sinead's service won't help me with wheelchair repairs. So where do I turn when I'm an employee? Because when I'm a student, I have a lot of options. But when I become an employee, who do I turn to?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a really, really important point too, because we're talking about jobs, we're talking about work, we're talking about employment. Often then we think about a small set of actors, but this is also a policy issue. This is a systems issue. And we're talking always about whole people, about whole lives. And so we need to understand every aspect of that. I think it's a really important point. Thank you. And so Susan, we'll wrap up with you.
Sure. So in relation to a post-secondary lens, I think a direction that we're really going to be starting to look at is work integrated learning, will, and experiential education. That's growing more and more in the university world. And what does that look like for an accommodation aspect for a student with a disability? I think it's a fantastic work integrated learning. It's fantastic that students, whether they're a student with a disability or not, have that opportunity to work on real life projects, bridge those gaps as we've been hearing. But what about the accommodations and how it's going to be measured, how it's going to be built within the existing curriculum and what that's going to look like going forward, because it's growing. Work integrated learning programs are growing, experiential education in universities is growing. And I think we need to have an understanding of what potential barriers may be there, what those barriers are going to look like, how we identify them, how we solve them. And Kim had talked earlier about transportation as an example, and Kim and I had talked previously. Transportation does tend to be a concern regardless of what city you live in. It's not only in the GTHA, it's not only in certain areas, it's across the board. So there's larger discussions that need to be had. And I think that from a university perspective, will is something that all eyes are on right now in relation to what's it going to look like when we're supporting and accommodating students with disabilities.
That's great. Oh, go ahead, Kim.
If I may make a point, transportation was also an issue when I'm a student. Because if you have a professor who says, if you come late, you're not allowed in. So transportation, lack of transportation hasn't just been an employee issue. It's been an issue all through my life. So it's not a barrier that goes away.
And that's true. If I could just add to that, Kim, when we do our classroom to career series, before COVID, when it was in person, we would have to strategically look at which rooms and which halls that we booked in relation to where Lyft would drop students off. So yes, there's a lot of coordinating that sometimes employers may not be aware of, but there's a lot of behind the scenes barriers that can present.
But my PhD research is looking at disability employment and lack of transportation. But when I did my literature review and looked at Statistics Canada reports, there's almost no mention about transportation being a factor. And so if an agency like Statistics Canada doesn't realize the effect of lack of transportation, how do we expect you as employers and service providers to recognize that as a barrier?
Thank you. Yeah, so we've gone many different places talking about the school to work transition here, right? And the complexity of these issues and the importance of, I think, collaborating, working together within that space. We're going to turn it now to question and answer. And so Emil Tompa in the front here is going to be carrying the mic around. And I have to say, I don't think there's a single word for it, but Emil is used to be my boss. And there's a lot of joy taken in directing your boss. So please join me in just enjoying this moment. So we have a question here.
Right here is what? Oh, sorry.
Hello? My question is in terms of the transition environment when transferring from school to work, in terms of technology. When we're trying to build resilience for individuals that have disabilities, there's often times where it's not just one transition, there are many transitions. They can transition to a work environment that closes, that downsizes, that lays off their position. So there's often many transitions within that opportunity before they are able to have a thriving career. So how do you approach that issue during your coaching sessions? Historically, for the deaf community, when RBC transitioned to more digital work, there were many deaf individual employees that lost their jobs. BlackBerry, when they downsized, again, many people with disabilities were impacted and losing their jobs. So they were therefore in another stage of transition and having to go back and restart the entire process again. So how do you build resiliency within the disability community?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And there's that concept, right, of like last in, first out, which I think relates to this, how transition. Sorry, I'm not sure if that was me. That these transition can happen at many points. And I mean, the stigma and discrimination aren't just something that happens at the initial point too, right? These are often ongoing and they present in many different ways as we go. So I'll turn it to the panelists. Sinead, you'd like to go first?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And that's something we've been looking at it. Yes, as the journey doesn't end when the person becomes employed. In fact, the journey begins then. Some ideas we've been looking at that have proven successful is creating champions within the workplace. So it shouldn't always be the person with disability having to advocate, but really educating the employers that it's not just about the first week, that persons with disabilities need to be recognized for their skills, promoted, transition to new careers, being seen to be people who should be advanced. So we're very interested in not just in transition into employment, but the advancement of persons with disabilities. And things that we've looked at are champions within the workplace, more employer training, ensuring they understand it's not just a token hire, upskilling people, making sure people have a mentor in the workplace, champions, and then really looking at equity. So getting them to understand that they should be looking at equitable advancement, upskilling and training, and really showing them, that when they do that, they'll strengthen their workforce and be able to advance people with disabilities in a better way. But I will agree with you, it's a huge issue. I think we're dealing with the issue of transitioning people into employment and then into advancement, which is what this committee is really looking at as well. So great question, thank you.
One of the frustrating things is having to fight the same battle over and over again. And something as simple as making meeting notes or presentation notes available a day or more in advance to the meeting can help people from the deaf community, help people with low vision. But often that's a battle that you're constantly fighting, constantly having to remind your employer. And if disability inclusion starts at the planning stage, at the beginning, then we're included. Because so often when disability accommodation is left to the end, there's no time to accommodate people's needs. So we have to change the mindset to actually think about disability inclusion the day we start planning a meeting or a social event or some other activity. Because disability inclusion doesn't have to be hard, but if you leave it to the last moment, it's almost impossible to do it properly.
Thanks, and we'll turn to Arif.
So from the researcher perspective, I think your question is a really important one and one that we've been grappling with for the last decade or more. What we know from the research is that precarious work is becoming a more common phenomenon for all workers. But I guess the concerning thing is that young workers with disabilities are often pushed into precarious forms of employment first. So when there is a mass change in our labor market, like a layoff, a pandemic, or an adoption of a widespread digital technology, it's often like the most vulnerable groups who get affected first. And I think one thing that we need to think about is how can we create supports and protections for persons with disabilities that are adequate for cost of living and quality of life and can buffer those potential disruptions to their work. Also, we need to think about how to better enable persons with disabilities to access job skills, upskilling and reskilling programs so that they can kind of evolve with our changing labor market and better navigate changes to work that they encounter. So for instance, if there is a disruption to their job because of the adoption of a new technology, how can they better gain the skills to adapt to that? A good example over the last year has obviously been the increasing use of ChatGPT. With ChatGPT came a host of new jobs. An example of that includes a prompt engineer, so being better able to prompt AI, right? So how can we understand what jobs are on the horizon and then offer inclusive skilling opportunities for workers with disabilities so that they can navigate the disruption?
Did you want to add anything?
Sure. I'll add, when we think about building resiliency, it's building the supports around us and having access to those supports, such as, yes, employment services, and having timely access to the supports, which is what Kim stressed as well. So it's a huge conversation. I know one of the services that we offer in our department at the Career Center is our TASTE mentoring program. Talk about studies to employment, that students have an opportunity to meet with someone who graduated from York University, is a York alum. We make that connection for them and they can have conversations with different employers around their areas of interest, around the supports that are built in. And it's having those supports in place sooner rather than later. And it's a huge topic, I agree.
Yeah, and there's so many other points I want to add to this, but as the moderator, I'm going to be quiet. And I would love to talk to you more after. I think, Emil, are we at time? Can we take another question?
No, actually, we're at time, so we're gonna have to cut it off here. But I just want to thank the group here: Dan Samosh, Arif Jetha, Susan Pogue, Sinead McCarthy, and Kim Atwood. You know where to find them. They'll be around all day. You can ask them questions in the halls, and when you can stop them, get some of their time to get some more insights about the great work that they've been sharing with us. Really great insights about research, programs and services, employer challenges and opportunities, the future of work and harnessing that potential, being proactive and flexible. I've taken lots of notes here. It's been a great session. So thank you so much for all these great insights.